Working class revolt from behind the Iron Curtain. So I previously did two other kickoffs that make a good background to this. How the Russian Revolution was lost, and In Defense of Leninism, which is about Trotskyism. Both of those are on our YouTube, where this will end up. So I'll be talking about the Russia under Stalin, state capitalism, the development of the Eastern Bloc, Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, and arguments on the left. I got a quote here. Rulers in the East and West had an interest in turning what socialism is really about on its head. Both sides feared the ideas of genuine socialism in which workers democratically run society in their own interests, and therefore distorted these ideas beyond recognition. Despite this, people did fight back in the Eastern Bloc, even to the point where workers' councils, a necessary element of genuine working class rule, were established in one particular struggle. So Dennis Kossuth. Russia under Stalin. So in the 1920s up until 1929, the working class was severely weakened. This was following civil war for several years. The working class was not controlling the state apparatus as it did in 1917 and 1918, right after the Russian Revolution. The working class and peasants, though, still had their interests were still influencing policy, and they had the right to strike. There were some remnants of the old guard Bolsheviks, such as Trotsky and the left opposition, who made arguments against the Stalin and the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy at this time was not yet unified, and party members were paid the same wages as skilled workers. After 1929, though, we see the beginning and the first of these 5-year plans, and this was rapid industrialization. So what Stalin was trying to do in just 5 years at a time was how the West developed as capitalist over decades or more. So this required Russia to exploit the working class at a higher rate just to compete with the West. So that's important to know. Also after 1929, we see the purges, removing opposition to Stalin and the bureaucracy. And Dennis Kossuth mentioned that 9/10 of the party leadership from the revolution was either executed, killed by Stalin, or died in prison. So along with the rapid industrialization came collectivization of farms, which was against the peasants, wanting land ownership. That was one thing that they won in the revolution. Bureaucratic control expanded. Wages were modified so that party members made more than workers, different than before. They abolished the independent trade unions, abolished the right to strike. There was some forced labor in prison camps, and opposition to the party was restricted. So I'll talk about the idea of state capitalism. Chris Harman discusses in these next couple of slides how Russia under Stalin was, by Marxist standards, still a capitalist state. So what he describes applies to the Western capitalist countries, as well as this applies to the USSR, but you could also say China, Cuba, other countries like that. And we'll get into that in a bit. So Marx talks about two features of capitalism. The methods of production of each producer have to be constantly changed due to the planned and anarchic changes in the methods of all other producers. So outside factors determine production process. This is Western capitalist economies influence Russia and its economy under Stalin. There's a separation of producers from the means of production. Marx calls this alienation of labor. Workers earn wages to buy goods, but their wages can drop due to market changes. Non-capitalist countries have to protect themselves by developing the forces of production. So this is like old monarchies in the in the early 1900s who were competing with capitalism. They still had to adjust just to exist. Rival owners of means of production produce goods in competition with one another. Each use their surplus obtained through exploitation to develop means of production to increase production and lower costs. The relationship between different means of production defines each as capital and their owners as capitalists. This also determines the interactions with one another and their workers to continually reproduce the process. With the development of a permanent arms economy, Russia had to compete with the West in arms production. Is a quote from Chris Harman. The ability of the Western rulers to threaten Russia was based on the development of industry through the continued extraction of surplus value. Stalin competed with the West by pumping a surplus out of the Russian population at a greater rate than extracted of the West. And so does the feature which above all makes capitalism a distinct mode of production for the mature Marx, that whereas under pre-capitalist societies, production is determined by the desires of the ruling class, and under socialism by the desires of the mass of the population, under capitalism, the nature and dynamic of production results from the compulsion on those who control production to extract a surplus in order to accumulate means of production in competition with one another. The particular way in which the ruling class owns the industry in Russia through its control of the state does not affect this essential point. That is why the only meaningful designation in Marxist terms for the society that has existed in Russia for the last 40 years is state capitalism. And then he's writing this in the 60s or 70s. I'm going to touch on a little bit of the degenerated worker state argument. So Trotsky argued that the workers could still peacefully take control of the state, and therefore Russia was a degenerated worker state. Orthodox Trotskyists would argue that Russia and its satellites were degenerated or deformed worker states, just like Russia. They viewed that state ownership was what made it socialist, as well as that it was won by a workers' revolution. Not sure who that person is. Good question. Russia survived World War II and extended its rule. And this showed that some of Trotsky's predictions didn't happen. He didn't live until, just at the beginning of World War II. So he didn't see the development of what I'll talk about next with the satellite states. And he didn't see this in order to adjust his analysis. So some of his followers still follow this degenerated worker state argument. A challenge to Trotsky's analysis was regimes without the characteristics of Russia were established without workers' revolutions. This would be in the satellite states. And this is contradictory to Marx's self-emancipation of the working class as the road to socialism. Trotskyist Tony Cliff and others argued for the term state capitalist for Russia in the Eastern satellites. All right, so now we'll talk about the development of the Eastern Bloc. And when I see Eastern Bloc, we can also call these the Soviet satellite states, and call them the Warsaw Pact countries. The dividing boundary is right through Europe here, and they called that the Iron Curtain. So the meeting of the big three winners of World War II, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, shaped the post-war world with an agreement to destroy German and Japanese power, to crush revolutionary revolts in Europe and Asia, to share joint domination over the world, and to have a division of spheres of influence. So this is where the Iron Curtain comes into play. Is it divides the world into Western influenced countries and Soviet influenced countries. So some of those countries that, we'll talk about just a couple, but when we're talking about the Eastern Bloc, specifically, we are talking about East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania up until the 60s, until they broke, and then Yugoslavia for a short period after the war. When we're talking about the USSR or the Soviet Union, I'll be more specific about that. So the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was a country. And this country included Russia, as well as all these other, what would separate to become independent countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, just to name a few, Belarus, and Ukraine. So I'll talk about that in a moment. The USSR included the territory of the old Tsarist Empire. These republics of the USSR were independent from around 1917 to 1922. After the dissolution of the USSR by 1991, the Russian or the non-Russian republics would split off, becoming independent countries, including Ukraine. We can see historically that Russia has had hegemony over Ukraine. Ukraine's borders have changed several times. Following Ukraine independence, more recently, we've seen Russia enter into conflicts. They reclaimed Crimea in 2014. And as we know, they've been invading the Donbass region since last year in eastern Ukraine. So just wanted to give a little context there, and maybe folks can talk about that more in the discussion. So back to talking more about the development of the Eastern Bloc. Stalin created regimes under direct or indirect control of the Red Army. So during World War II, the Red Armies moved into these countries, and they remained after World War II during the Eastern Bloc countries. So control over satellite states was used to subordinate them to the accumulation goals. I'll talk about war reparations first. So former Nazi allied countries such as Hungary and Romania had to pay money to the USSR for siding with the Nazis, basically. This came from and punished the working class for the political decisions of the old ruling elite. But also, it's important to note that Hungary and Romania were under Nazi influence, and then right after that, under Soviet influence. And we'll talk about what that looked like, how it was oppressive for them. But getting back to this. The Soviet Union also seized industrial equipment from some of these Eastern Bloc countries. They exploited the satellites through trade, where they had a monopoly. They prevented the satellites from developing their industry. They had a huge supply of cheap raw materials that they could extract from the Eastern Bloc. And they used revolutionary phraseology to conceal their counter-revolutionary attempts. One more quote from Harman. Russian influence was used to ensure that communists obedient to Moscow would be able to use control over the state apparatus, obtained through participation in coalition government with the bourgeois and social democratic parties, to eliminate all other political and social forces, to carry through a revolution from above, and to dominate society through a Stalinist apparatus. So we also saw a continual purging of the local communist bureaucracies in the Eastern Bloc, mirroring what was going on within the Soviet Union prior to that. Russia restored the old order in the Eastern Bloc, so the bourgeoisie, and in some cases, former fascists in Bulgaria and Romania, as in they were elevated to work within the Communist Party, during this era that we're talking. Growth rates slowed down by the 50s and 60s economically, and there was a failure to raise living standards and conditions. So this weakened the ability of these Eastern Bloc countries to compete internationally. When popular movements revolted against the satellite bureaucracies, Russia used military intervention to restore bureaucratic rule. And so this is where you see a lot of tanks in the next many slides. So first, we'll talk about the East German uprising. This was just over a couple of days, so it wasn't very long, but started with construction workers strike in East Berlin. 1 million people protested around the country. There was declining living standards, unpopular Sovietization policies, and a wave of strikes and protests was put down by the Soviet forces in Germany. The crisis of state capitalism. So Chris Harman describes a similar development around events in Poland and Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So this applies to these different situations. There was a failure of economic balanced growth, which created splits in the state apparatus, where the Eastern Bloc countries questioned their relationship to Russia. The reforming bureaucracy organizes and looks for allies within and outside the party to paralyze the conservative elements in the apparatus. Workers join the reforming bureaucracy, but also develop consciousness. Reformers try to reassert class structure through cold and hot methods such as military repression, and reformers are forced to give up reform. So this applies to all the situations we'll talk about next. So first, the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Hungary had political instability, economic stagnation, and there was anger towards the AVH, which was the secret police. And I should note that most of the Eastern Bloc countries had a secret police which repressed opposition and such. There was a student demonstration in solidarity with Poland, and protests became mass action. There was a call for the removal of Russian troops and local heads of state. There was a clash with the AVH, and it transformed a peaceful protest into a revolutionary insurrection. Reformer Imre Nagy formed a new government. Russian troops entered into cities to regain control. Armed workers and soldiers joined the rebellion. Councils of workers, soldiers, and students were formed. Khrushchev, who led the USSR at that time, invaded with thousands of tanks and airstrikes. Nagy was executed, and up to 20,000 people were killed. The more violent part of this revolution happened around just under 2 weeks, but some of the activity lasted for months around that. When workers couldn't fight back anymore, they began a general strike, but without outside support, the revolution ended. So this is the origin of the term tanky, and I believe it started in England, but when it was used as against people who were leftists who supported the Soviet Union sending tanks into Hungary. They were called tankies for supporting the military repression. Quote from Dennis Kosith: "This wasn't a war of liberation. It was a total war to annihilate the idea that workers of Hungary or anywhere else in the Eastern Bloc had the right to run their own lives or determine their own future." Hungarian workers' councils. So similar to before the Russian Revolution, where they had the Soviets, which were workers' councils, we see this in Hungary too. Councils of workers and students were formed in neighborhoods all over the country. There were councils in factories, villages, and lower class neighborhoods. They reorganized economic, political, and social life, declared freedom of the press, and distributed propaganda, distributed arms to the general population, and the police and army joined the revolutionary cause. Quote from Chingo and Alcoy: "These new democratic institutions were the very demonstration that an alternative political regime to Stalinist bureaucratic terror was possible. as they not only conserved the foundations of the nationalized economy, but they also strengthened it through reforms. While I was doing research, I came across this picture and a caption of this girl, and pictures of her became symbolic, for the Hungarian Revolution. But her story was, her name was Erika Zelis. She was 15 at the time of this picture. She lived in Budapest with her mom. Erika's dad died in World War II. She was becoming a cook and worked at a hotel when the revolution broke out. And she was inspired by her friends to join a group of Hungarian freedom fighters and worked as a Red Cross nurse to help the injured. She was shot in the neck by a Soviet soldier November 7th of 1956, when the revolution was already suppressed. So, after some of the main fighting. But again, she was only 15. The Hungarian Revolution's social and political content was extremely subversive. A working class revolution in a so-called socialist country against the local Stalinist bureaucracy that did not turn towards Western powers or the former local ruling classes to restore capitalism. On the contrary, the insurgents of the Hungarian Revolution were fighting to build true socialism, liberated from the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union, in which the workers, peasants, and oppressed masses would be the true masters of their destiny and power. All right, so now I'll talk about the Prague Spring in 1968. This is in Czechoslovakia. There was economic stagnation that led to factory closures and lowering of wages. Reformer Alexander Dubček and his followers criticized the Novotny regime. Debate spread to involve millions through TV, newspapers, and mass meetings. New political groups issued a manifesto, and millions signed a petition calling for citizens to engage in the reform process. Dubček attempted to negotiate with Brezhnev, who was the leader of the USSR at the time, but the Soviet Union sent in 165,000 troops and 4,600 tanks to Czechoslovakia. Resistance sabotaged street signs, and rail workers sabotaged rail lines to thwart the efforts of the USSR. Dubček, under the control of the USSR, was allowed to implement some reforms towards normalization, but he faced mass demonstrations from workers. And ultimately, what the normalization meant was returning to the status quo before the conflict. Quote from Kossuth, because of a working class organization, because of a lack of working class organization outside of the official trade union networks and the continued hold that some of the reformers had over significant sections of the working class, the bureaucracy was ultimately successful at isolating the radical elements and reasserting complete control over the trade unions by the autumn of 1960. So I'll talk about Revolutionary 1968. And when I wrote this title, I had in mind, Neil Davidson wrote in Revolutionary Rehearsals in Neoliberal Age about revolutionary conjunctures. These are periods of time when international revolution was possible. 1968 to 1976 was one of those periods. So the role of the media, workers took over newspapers and radio. There were reports on bureaucracy corruption within Czechoslovakia. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia was broadcasted on TV all around the world, and the Prague Spring occurs at the same time as other international events. The French workers' strike, protests at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the Vietnam War, as well as other movements of liberation with women, Blacks, Indigenous, students, workers, and more. Quote from Phil Gasper, "It was a stunning moment internationally as anti-war protesters at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago were brutalized by the forces of the state. Television screens were filled with images of another occupying army, Russian tanks on the streets of Prague and Czechoslovakia. In that moment, the connection of the struggle, East and West, North and South, for a different world free from state repression, oppression, and exploitation was felt by millions. The events in Czechoslovakia proved to people around the world that socialism in the socialist countries was as phony as democracy was in the democratic West. It was another in a succession of rebellions and revolutions that set the stage for the toppling of the whole Stalinist system 2 decades later in 1989. Collapse of Stalinism. So first I'll say in this kickoff, I'm not talking about Poland. This is due to, we're going to be doing some kickoffs over the next couple of months on the chapters from the book Revolutionary Rehearsals, the first one, and I'm going to be doing the one on Poland and the Solidarity Movement in 1980. But that relates to this whole topic and talk as well. So mass strikes and demonstrations in 1988 led to the fall of the communist parties in Eastern Bloc countries, and the USSR dissolved in 1991. Quote from Chingo and Alcoy: "The Hungarian Revolution demonstrated that the restoration of capitalism and private property, which came a few decades later, was not the only possibility opposite the policies of the bureaucracy and power. A revolutionary left-wing alternative did indeed exist against the Stalinist falsification of socialism. Quite the reverse, crushing the Hungarian Revolution by Stalinism with fire and sword in 1956, and the subsequent revolutions in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Poland in 1980 created the very conditions for Stalinism's self-implosion, the fall of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991, and the restoration of capitalism. This relatively pacific process involved an economic and social counter-revolution on a historic scale for which the region's masses are still paying the price." And that is to say, too, that even after the fall of Stalinism, the fall of USSR, obviously the working class is still oppressed as they return under capitalist rule, just as they were before. I'm going to talk about some arguments on the left. Generally applying to some liberals, reformists, and anarchists, they view revolutionary socialism can't work and will lead to oppressive Stalinist bureaucracies like seen in the Eastern Bloc, since socialism was the most dominant and common form of socialism in the 20th century. But others also, too, just in the general, kind of liberal category, associate state ownership of property with socialism. And if they got state ownership of property, they must be socialist, which is not correct. Orthodox Trotskyists view Stalinist states still as worker states, but degenerated by the bureaucracy. They forget at times that Trotsky was a Marxist and a Leninist. The importance of theory in analyzing all aspects of so-called socialist regimes, not just some, such as the state ownership of property and means of production. When we're talking about that, we have to ask the question: there's state ownership of property and the means of production, but who owns the state? In the case of the Eastern Bloc, it was the ruling bureaucratic elite. Stalinists and Marxist-Leninists defend Stalinism as an oppositional force to Western imperialism. They support similar so-called socialist regimes in the global South. And this is where the idea of campism comes into play. Campism is used for leftists who support regimes that oppose U.S. imperialism. The only problem is at times these regimes they support are oppressive to their own people and their own workers. Just a few examples of that would be, some of Marxist-Leninists might support the Assad regime in Syria, might support Castro in Cuba. I did a whole kickoff on that. And, so on and so forth. I think that's all I'll say here. I'll leave some more of that for the discussion. I might have more comments to add in. I just want to talk for a moment about hegemony. The Communist Party of the USSR had a hegemonic relationship with its states and the Eastern Bloc. I would argue they acted as an imperialist power, competing with, but also mirroring the West. Within the republics of the USSR and Eastern Bloc satellites, they were run by a bureaucratic elite in Moscow. Communist parties were brought to power with direction from Moscow. Opposition within and outside the party was silenced. Military repression was used to put down working class revolts, strikes, and protests. A trade monopoly was established. Means of production, raw materials, land, capital, so on, were exploited. Economic conditions and standard of living worsened, and there was a lack of democracy and workers' power. So maybe another topic for discussion was the USSR imperialist? How so, how not? So I'll end with this, the importance of Marxism. We need to use a Marxist or dialectical materialist analysis to examine movements, revolts, and other revolutionary situations, as well as their results. Marx advocated for the self-emancipation of the working class, or socialism from below. He also advocated for fighting against all forms of exploitation and oppression. We see this self-emancipation of the working class in the examples of the Hungarian Revolution, in the Prague Spring, and more. We can learn from these revolutionary situations as they model a path for the working class to unite and organize against the ruling class. So I'll end there, and these are some of the works that I cited throughout my kickoff, as well as I recommend all of these if you're interested in learning more about this.